Right, back again, number 10, man. We're at the 20% mark here, so
Yeah, that's pretty good.
finally making some headway. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Cool. I think you said you were gonna take away the summary this time, so I'll
Yeah. All right.
lean
So
back and
in the this might take a while. This conversation was
so
about.
it's a Zane summary. It's a
Yeah.
summary the way I
Well,
did it. Yeah. Okay.
I
Perfect.
did it as best as I could, but it'll take at least
Yeah.
5-6 minutes. So
Okay,
in the
not
last
20.
one, he was expanding on the different kinds of attention, right? So he introduced the
Yep.
idea of scaling down our attention, where we let go of the gestalt and we attend to our own basic conscious experience in a maximal way, whereas scaling up was consonant with fully diving into the gestalt and outside of ourselves into a hyperflow state. And he went on to point out that training the mind to scale up and scale down in this manner in a fluid and flexible way increased the chances of finding insight when insight was required, and further also opened the door for profoundly meaningful and impactful mystical like experiences, something that we're going to be calling higher states of consciousness. And these states are reported across cultures and traditions throughout time, and they're described by those who experience them as being pivotal and deeply meaningful and tied to insight. So lecture 10, which is the one we're going to be diving into today, lays the groundwork for us to further explore what these higher states of consciousness are by unpacking some of the theories of consciousness first. Only if we can have some working theories about consciousness itself can we then consider how higher states of consciousness might work. So he first refers us to the Global Workspace Theory of consciousness, which holds that consciousness is akin to the desktop of a computer, the place where different bits of information are put together in a manner that is useful. It has a framing function in that it eliminates the near infinite possible things that we could be attending to and only showcases those things that we find relevant at the moment. And in a similar way, another model of consciousness is the integrated information theory, which holds that what consciousness is the merging together of bits of information that fit with each other in ways that are useful to us. And in this way, consciousness is essentially a complexification mechanism. It complexifies information, taking bits of pieces of information and generating more complex ideas. Now, embedded in both models is the process of relevance realization. In other words, both ways of thinking about consciousness, and they're not mutually exclusive ways, suggest that somehow consciousness is a mechanism of presenting us with information that is relevant and salient to us, and that the process of determining what is relevant or not is something that occurs in consciousness. So what appears to be happening in consciousness is as follows. At any given moment in time, we have an infinite amount of things that might appear in our consciousness. There's data from the external world, and there's data from our inner world, meaning memories and thoughts. And from this infinite set of data points, our consciousness inherently is able to pick out features of objects in consciousness. But some objects are more salient than others, and so we foreground some of these objects. And then we make sense of those things in the foreground to create an overall impression or gestalt, so that the focus of our conscious experience ends up being the end result of this dynamical scanning and relevance generation machinery. So in other words, consciousness generates a salience landscape for us. There's a selection process, perhaps quite mysterious, that presents in our consciousness those things that are somehow deemed to be most salient. If this is how consciousness works, then it stands to reason that altering our states of consciousness would also alter our salience generating machinery. So given an identical set of initial conditions in a given instant, the conscious experience would differ based on how the salience-making machinery was tuned in the mind. The salience landscape leads to an understanding of how we might maneuver ourselves. So to give a simplistic example, if we find ourselves in the middle of a flight of stairs, the salience landscape would identify our position, and we would understand that we had the option of standing still, of going up the stairs or going down the stairs. the set of maneuvers, possible maneuvers that we might deploy within any given state is known as our affordance or our presence landscape. And Vervaeke argues, though, that we see the world more as a presence landscape more than anything else. So given that the presence landscape then lays out a working model of how we might interact with the objects in our consciousness, we then do the work of engaging with those objects so that we might try to determine the cause and effect of things. So he gives the example of a toddler exploring a spoon. They'll manipulate the spoon in any number of ways. They'll bang it, they'll drop it, they'll grasp it in different ways. They put it in their mouth. And what's happening there is that the toddler is forming a depth landscape. The toddler is learning all of the cause-effect relationship that exists between his actions and the spoon and the world. So the ability to find cause-effect relationships, which is the ability to understand how the world is really working, is dependent on our salience landscaping, which ultimately leads to the depth landscaping. And then he goes on to give an example of the toddler who's offered two groups of candy, and he has to choose between the two groups. If both groups have exactly the same pieces of candy, but one group is just spread out a little bit more so that it appears to take more space, the toddler always goes for the group that looks larger. And the point is made that the toddler is unable to recognize that the empty space between the pieces of candy are not actually relevant, a realization that the toddler eventually grows out of. But just as the toddler doesn't understand that there's no difference in the two groups of candy because their salience landscaping is imprecise, we adults might perceive reality through similarly faulty salience landscaping, a condition that can only be undone if we alter the mechanisms by which the salience landscaping occurs. And these mechanisms are altering our states of consciousness. If we are in a different state of consciousness, we are essentially operating with an altered salience landscaping machinery, which then leads to an altered depth landscape and thus the potential for insight. So now that we have some language to talk about with respect to how consciousness might work, we return to the idea of higher states of consciousness. So Vervaeke points out that not all altered states are higher states of consciousness. When we are, say, dreaming or drunk or we're high, we perceive the world differently. And that experience of the world doesn't carry the import of being real or deeply important in any way. And when we come out of these states, we reject these experiences as not being representative of our reality. However, when people experience the higher states of consciousness, such as the Buddha did and many others after him and likely before him, those experiences are always considered to represent a truer version of reality than the one that we typically experience. People say that the reality they perceive in higher states of consciousness was the really real, and that their day-to-day lives are otherwise illusionary. So, and this conviction is so strong that people reshape their lives entirely so they can live their lives to be more consonant with this state. And the changes that these people experience are well documented as being positive and healthy. So we have to take this experience seriously. But it also exposes a bit of a conflict that has to be resolved. The call or the drive that is created in order to reorder one's life after experiencing this really real state, that drive is called autonormativity. But why does it occur? Why do we have this state of autonormativity? Why are we compelled to make fundamental changes in our lives when we experience them? It doesn't make sense on the face of it because it doesn't align with our Platonic sense of reality. With Plato, true reality, the really real, was the world of forms, or eidos, which were well defined. They had a language. But with higher states of consciousness, people often have ineffable experiences. They can't describe what they felt, but they just know that they were in contact with reality in a very deep way. They don't actually come out of these states with any new philosophical insight or an essay or some data that they carry back with them. In a similar way, when the child grows up and realizes that the two groups of candy are the same, what changes is their perception of them. They aren't learning new math. And he says the next lecture will dive into the question of why these higher states of consciousness occur at all, and whether these changes that the people experience are rooted in anything that is fundamentally, philosophically sound.
Yeah. No, I think that's a decent summary. I think it's a lot to cover. You know, I mean, it's hard
Yeah, it is.
to put all of it into a short time. Um, you know, I think a couple of things that I well, we can talk about. I don't even know if I understood them differently, but maybe we can just flesh out what's happening there.
Sure.
Um, I don't know how much it was really in conflict with Plato's view. Um, for the following, basically going back to the allegory of the cave, in that the notion that you can have a shadow view of an eidos, right? Rather than, and then you can grow up, you can become awakened, you can, you know, unchain yourself and go, and you can see the fire, you know, and the echoes and the things that are making noise, and even that's also not really real, right? Because then you can exit the cave and you can actually go out into the sunlight. Um, so I do think that Plato had some intuition, and he even talks about how Plato did have mystical experience, right? He had the Pythagorean side of shamanistic kind of background, and so I do think Plato had some awareness of that. Uh, um, that the idol, your perception of the eidos of something can evolve to where you perceive, and maybe that's another a different way of saying the same thing, is how you form your conception of the eidos of things. That machinery can be elevated. If you're forming your eidos based on shadows and echoes, then you can actually take a step of consciousness higher and higher, and ultimately come into really real contact with reality out in the sunshine, even though it's
Mm.
blinding, right? And then you are forming your eidos very differently of things. And I think that that's another way of kind of expressing why it has that ontonormativity, right? Is that just like literacy, you know, you can't unlearn how to read. You can't look at something that is written in a language you know and not read it.
Mm.
But similarly, once you have reached a developmental stage, once you're able to know that the space between the candies is not as relevant as the number of the candies, you can't unknow that, right?
Mm.
And I think that one-way transformation to deeper contact with reality is part of what creates that ontonormativity. Is that if you really feel like, oh, I was listening to shadows and echoes, and now I'm out in the sunlight looking around at the real world, you can't go back to having an eidos based on shadows and echoes. You just you're stuck with it, right? Um, so yeah, I think that it'll be interesting to see how that all is wrapped up in the next lecture. And of course, this lecture and the next one are tied very closely, right? Because here he's
Mm.
starting the discussion of consciousness, um, but moving on to the notion of higher states of consciousness, which is still to come in lecture 11. So um, I think the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit, and you were moving so fast, I think that maybe I'm nitpicking framing or phrasing in a summary, but um, you know, the notion of it's worth reviewing, right? How or debating, even if we see it differently, um, the overall structure, the eidos, the eidos of consciousness that he explicates, the feature schema, so to speak,
Mm.
um, that, you know, in your salience landscape, um, there is sort of a list of features, maybe, right? Um, and some of that is foregrounded for you. There's an interesting notion there. And I do think that, and we can come back to that. I'm just going to re-summarize maybe at more depth of this concept, and we can go back and
Sure.
debate. But it's interesting. I think this is where maybe some of the debates we even have about nature and nurture and so on and so forth is, you know, pre-puberty, you know, a girl's shape is not foregrounded the way it is after, right? And so there is a change in the features are there, but it's not foregrounded in the same way it is once you hit puberty, right? But there is a process. So some of that may be biological as well. Some of that may be, cultural. What's important culturally? Like what do we pay attention to? All these different things may factor into what things are foregrounded for us in some sense, or what things we perceive more strongly. But those are still features, ultimately. Those are items that get foregrounded. The notion of figurization, I think, was quite interesting on a couple levels, in that out of those features, we then form a gestalt, right? So, we take these different aspects of things we perceive that are brought forward and highlighted by our culture, history, memory, biology, and then we form those into an abstract, right? We abstract those into a notion.
Right.
And often, we touched on this very early in the first video we made, we may then name that abstract complex. And that act of naming makes that a figure.
Yeah.
Right, is another way to say it. The interesting thing is that the figure itself then also becomes a feature. Once you've abstracted something and you say, oh, okay, that complex set of features is, an item, is a system, right? That is, numeracy, right? Well, then the concept of numeracy itself becomes abstracted, and you could say, okay, I'm using numeracy to help me highlight concepts of money or concepts of, whereas it may have been money that created the numeracy. And so there's a looping back there of, once you abstract, then you figurize and name, and then that thing becomes manipulable as a feature in itself. So there is kind of a dynamical looping there that I thought was really important. And all of that is kind of in the framing of solving problems. And we don't mean like huge problems. It may be like, how am I going to walk across this room? Like, how am I going to drink this cup of coffee, right? And so even in those quote-unquote problems, I have to have this figure. That's a cup. The cup contains the coffee. I understand. And then that's sort of the evolution, the transition, at least as I understood it, from the salience landscape to the presence landscape, or the series of affordances, right? So once I've figurized things, plus I have a conception of myself in the context of a framed problem, now that cup is graspable, as he gives the example, and I am in that presence landscape. I am a grasper. It is an agent arena relationship, right? Is that I'm in the arena of drinking coffee, and I am a grasper, and that cup is graspable, and I can drink the coffee out of it. So that's the affordance landscape. It's the perception of options, right? Then out of that emerges the depth landscape, which is the set of causal patterns, right? It's not random that the coffee is able to arrive to my lips, right? And we get there through repeated experiment. I thought that was an interesting feature, or aspect is 2-year-olds, experiment with the spoon. What can I do with this, right? That's the affordance landscape. But, I threw the spoon and the light came on. Okay, is that causal? No, when I throw the spoon the second time, the light didn't come on.
Yeah.
Right? It just happened to be, whatever, mom flicked the light on at the same time, right? Or my left toe tingled when I threw the spoon. Okay, let me throw it 40 more times and see if this is actually a causal pattern, right? And so that gets into the nature is like, well, I perceive this agent arena relationship, but how much of my perception of the arena is real? How much of that relationship perceived is actually an agent arena relationship? Because if I think the cup is graspable, but I actually don't have causal control, then that arena is illusory. So it reveals that, right? I may think that I can drink coffee out of, a pot or something, or, whatever. And,
Right.
and that agent arena relationship is revealed as illusory when I try to turn the light on by throwing the spoon. Maybe that's a better example. And then it doesn't work, and I realize, oh, actually, that I don't have that agent arena relationship, right? So that depth landscape serves as kind of a reality check on some level of true causation. And all of that, the salience, presence, and depth landscape, is what he calls the significance landscape, right? The combination of those is that significance landscape, and that is your consciousness, and transforming that is what allows you not because within that you may have insights, you may have ideas, you may have, oh, this is how I solve the problem of drinking the coffee, right? But if you have misformed the notion of a cup, then you need an insight about how you are forming insights, right? And that machinery, transforming that, seeing things from a different point of view, puts you in deeper contact with reality. It pulls you out into the sunlight, going back to our previous analogy, and that has force. That's like, no, you were not forming idoses correctly, right? Here's how you form. Now I've seen through. Now I'm no longer confused about whether the space is relevant, and I see through the illusion that I've been bullshitting myself with before, and now I'm in deeper contact with reality because my whole significance landscape is transformed.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was also struck by is, and this is something, he kind of papered over, don't blame him, right? Because I don't think we really understand this at all, is that the brain seems to have, the mind seems to have an inherent ability to decide how the relief of the salience landscape is going to look, right? So it casts, perception, out into the world, and even, to some extent within, and only certain things filter through. And we don't really seem to have a lot of control over that sort of filtering process, right? And, we do these sort of exercises, meditation, contemplation, to sort of change our brain's ability to recognize salience in a different way. But, there's still an automaticity still there. We alter it, right? We change it. We challenge some of the salience assumptions that are being made. But a lot of the work is sort of happening subconsciously. I think me and you have talked in the past as well about the importance of naming, right? Or the philosophy, or the profundity of naming is, I think, the way that we put it, is that when we put a label around something and say, well, this is the thing that it is, that, is the end result of a whole bunch of salience landscaping and depth landscaping processes that are, somewhat outside of our control. And, is that just all automata? Is that relief landscape that is generated for us by our mind, is that a fully automatic process? Are we sort of jiggering the system a little bit through our meditative practices and our attempts to alter our states of consciousness so that, the automatic process collapses, in a different way? I mean, if we think about attention or consciousness as a waveform, and the salience landscape is sort of the waveform collapsing into a certain, in a certain way. When we alter our consciousness, are we? What I'm getting at is that the collapsing of the waveform doesn't seem to be in our control. We just have it collapse differently, but it doesn't actually seem to be.
It's an interesting thing, actually. I've been recently talking to a friend about a lot of these things, so it's very much on the top of my mind. It's an interesting thing, I think, because there is um, what you might call a liminal space between consciousness and unconsciousness, and it's right here
what
at
is a
this notion.
luminal
Liminal.
space?
It's
Liminal.
a bordering space, a demilitarized zone, right? Um,
Okay. Between
so
what?
consciousness and unconsciousness, or conscious processes and unconscious processes. You can choose to pay attention to something, right? Like, and that's partly what meditation is. It's training your ability to pay attention, to renew your interest, as he says, your interesse, right? So
Yeah.
to say, well, I'm going to choose to, you know, move my attention back from the probe into the feeling, into the sensation, into the right. I'm altering my attention very consciously, so that no, the cup is no longer salient. Now the probe is salient. Now my fingers are salient. You know, so you're choosing what's foregrounded, right? And there is an ability to choose. Um, so that is the conscious aspect of foregrounding, right? And meditation, contemplation is training on how to make that choice, strengthening the muscle of choosing what is foregrounded, because so much depends on it, right? On the other hand, most of the time in daily life, what is foregrounded is not chosen consciously. It's unconscious, right? So, you know, hot girl walks by and you know, that catches my attention, right? It's foregrounded for me, right? And there, you know, it's that thing. Is there an affordance landscape here? Is there a way for me to enter into an agent arena relationship there, right? Um,
Right.
and so,
It's the new
um,
model of dating and approaching women.
yes, correct.
Right.
But I guess that, and the examples that are commonly used in meditative practices, I think, are quite, you know, most of the time when we're breathing, we breathe unconsciously, right? However, you can take conscious control. You can choose to breathe deeper. You can choose to breathe slower. You can choose, you know, you can choose to make yourself short of breath, right? And not breathe enough. You can choose to hyperventilate. Like, you, you can do all of these things consciously. We just usually don't. Now, the interesting thing is, if you practice breathing slower and deeper, is it possible that to change so that you start breathing slower the rest of the time, right? And so there is this sort of like movement from, and there's language in other areas, like the movement from conscious competence to unconscious competence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when you first learn to drive a car, it's very conscious control, and then gradually you gain unconscious expertise, and it moves into your unconscious, right? So same thing I would say with what is foregrounded. If you consciously train yourself to pay attention to certain things, what do we do that in medical training? When you
Mm.
interact with someone in that agent arena relationship, certain things are foregrounded that were not foregrounded for before
Right.
you went through that training,
That's a
right?
good example. Right.
And it's unconscious. Like, you pay attention to how they're breathing, you have a general gestalt sense of how sick they are,
Yeah.
et cetera, right? Um, Another great example that I really like is the notion of juggling, right?
Mm.
Is, you know, if you're trying to learn to juggle, let's say, even three balls, right? But let's say you know how to do three, you want to move to five or whatever. Well, the challenge of that is it has to be done all at once. It's a gestalt. You can't learn, you know, you can't move from three juggling to five juggling piece by piece. You just sort of at some point have to pick up five balls and give it a
Mm.
shot, and
Mm.
keep failing drastically until your brain sort of finds that rhythm, right? And then you'll lose it. Like, you'll find it for a second and then you'll lose it, right? And the balls will fall again and again. Then you have to pick it up and start over again. But ultimately, your brain unconsciously, because and I think that's kind of the interesting thing, is that you're foregrounding the balls, you're foregrounding the throwing on some level, What you're trying to foreground is the rhythm you don't know. What is the rhythm of throwing, height, force, whatever,
Yeah.
that allows you to juggle and maintain that pace evenly by throwing the balls in the pattern. So you can only approach that by foregrounding you can't really foreground what you don't know, right? But you can foreground everything around it, and your unconscious mind will tune into finding that rhythm after repeated exposures. And then ultimately, once you find that rhythm, it's actually done better unconsciously, right?
Yeah.
Because you'll have the muscle memory, and that's true of anything we develop muscle memory about, is that it's better unconscious, right? It's smoother. When you try to, if there's something you're really good at unconsciously, he gives the boxing example in the previous lecture, right? And then you pull that into consciousness, you make yourself self-aware, you actually do less well, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really interesting notion of like the weird semi-selectivity of foregrounding and creating your salience landscape, and readjusting your salience landscape when you want to accomplish something.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, coming back to the idea of insights and the connection of that with salience landscaping, it seems to me that a lot of, say, wisdom or insight is really about, this is going to be oversimplistic, right? But it's kind of about how you view things differently. And this is a gross oversimplification of the idea, but it's, you're in a certain, say, situation in life, like just, to bring it to some practical thing, right? You're at a crossroads in your career or a relationship, or there's some conflict that you need to resolve. And you find yourself stuck. You're like, oh, I'm sort of like a prisoner in this situation, because every time you live or reassess the situation in your mind, you're basically still carrying forward the same set of assumptions every single time you run the loop, right? You're thinking about it exactly the same way because you're sort of frozen into the sort of basic initial conditions or initial assumptions that you're working with. And then, the meditative practices, contemplation, and meditation, the scaling in, the scaling down, and the scaling up allow you, in that particular example, to reassess the assumptions that you've made. That, okay, these are the base assumptions. This is what I wanted to do in this situation, and this is the predicament that I find myself in. And then in order to look at the situation in a different way, you have to like go back and reassess all of your basic assumptions and then build up an alternative viewpoint to see if the thing could have been looked at differently. And that would, that in itself is an insight, for me.
Yeah.
Because a lot of us, I think about breakthroughs as like, I just need to like read or get some bit of advice about, what to do here. And once like I get the right piece of information, the puzzle will unlock, right? I'm just like
because that is often true. And that's kind of the thing, is often that is all you need. You're missing a bit of information. You're missing an insight in consciousness, as he would say, right? You just don't know how to solve this problem. Then sometimes, unfortunately, the reason you don't know how to solve this problem is you have a problem with how you solve problems, right?
Yeah.
And it's
You
not
have
just
all the information you need. Yeah, you have all the
information. You don't have the capability of insight. Your insightfulness is a problem, right? Or the structure of your life is a problem. You are foregrounding the wrong things, right? So that's so often. There's so many examples of how, you keep trying to solve a particular problem a particular way, right? And then the actual insight comes from the fact that none of those ways were ever going to work. The problem isn't even what you thought it was, right? So, silly example maybe, but there's I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Wag Doge. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Doge. Firefighter, got caught with his team in a runaway blaze that was kind of headed their way. And they started sprinting away from the fire. And it was really spreading. I mean, the fire can spread very, very fast over grassland. It was catching up with them, this and that. And the idea entered his head that it's not a problem of how to run faster, right? And that is a problem, right? You can drop equipment, you can, take things off. There are ways of running faster. But he realized that actually what he should do is he took out a lighter and he lit the grass around him on fire. And it burned away from him and he laid down in the middle of it, right? So that when that other fire came, there was nothing to burn near him, right? And that technique is now called an escape fire. It's actually taught. But he invented it kind of spur of the moment because that insight, that flash of insight sort of happened not just about the problem. It's not the problem of how to run faster.
Right.
Right? And that's kind of that a trivial example compared to what, maybe what we're talking about, but it is that idea is that like you have an insight about, wait, I'm trying to solve the wrong problem. It's the same thing with the 9-dot problem, right? On a even more trivial level, is you're trying to figure out how to draw the lines, and then you realize it's not just about how to draw the lines. It's I'm trapped inside this box. I've artificially trapped myself, right? So it's an insight about how you framed the problem, right? So in order to have that, you have to step out of your current salience landscape, out of your current affordance landscape, and sort of like redo that whole thing, and that's transformative, right? When you see the whole thing, as you said, in a different viewpoint. But it's hard too because it's never, at least as far as I know, there's no way to tell if the reason you haven't solved a problem is because you've missed a bit of data or because you just haven't had the right insight yet. Yeah. Or if you are solving the wrong problem in some sense. And the 9-dot problem is not a connect the dots problem. You assumed it was a connect the dots problem. It's not, right? You added that in. It's a 4-line problem. And the lines don't have to change direction at dots. And so, I don't know, man. I think that is the big tricky part is, every time you're like, oh, like I don't exactly see, I don't know how to do my taxes. I mean, that's not a moment to necessarily go do whatever. Or maybe it is, right?
Or maybe you shouldn't be doing your taxes at all. Maybe you should just move to another country. Right. You're solving the wrong problem. You should just be a criminal.
Exactly. Yes, correct. Exactly right. Exactly right. Maybe your true destiny is to go to prison.
Exactly. Right.
But no, but I mean, I think that is kind of one of those problems, right? Where it's like, it's never clear when you're approaching a specific thing. And maybe that's why we wait for multiple problems to accumulate, right? When our whole life is kind of a bit problematic, then we become more open to the notion that, oh, maybe I do need to really step back. Like I'm not struggling with this problem, but I'm doing pretty well otherwise, right? I'm really discontent with my life. I feel maybe the meaning crisis is on some level. Now we're going way beyond the lecture, but just speculating, right? Maybe that experience of the meaning crisis is a notion that, hey, this is not just a single problem to solve. This is a transformative issue, right? You're trying to, and you've experienced that. I think we've talked about that in our lectures. Like, you're trying to solve the problem of like, well, which job should I take? What should I do with my career? Maybe you need to step back and be like, well, what is my sense of meaning? What is my purpose? It's not just like, which hospitalist job do I take, right? Like, which hospital do I go work at? That's the wrong problem, right? Now, when you solve or when you get insight into the meaning problem, then you say, oh, this hospital because it has residents. Oh, this this experience is going to be.
Yeah.
So it kind of does solve that problem for you, but not at all in the way that you were thinking, because before it was just, I'm exaggerating, but before it was just about like which EMR and how much
Yeah.
hassle and how many patients per day and so on and so forth. And then that deeper transformation happens and you're like, well, okay, actually what I need is a teaching experience.
To be teaching.
Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
It also makes sense, given this model of consciousness and how we end up forming these depth landscapes, right, and affordance landscapes, because by the time we get to the depth landscape and we're looking at causal patterns, at that point we have sort of ingrained in us certain assumptions about how the world works. I mean, these causal patterns could be misinterpreted by us as correlative patterns. We could be looking at them like, well, this is how the world works, but it was correlative the whole time, right? And this goes back to the first lecture where we was talking about flow states, where really what flow states are the ability to pick up between correlative and causative patterns, the ability to be in greater contact with reality and to figure out what actually is causal. It's kind of striking to me how our notion of meaning and purpose and connection with reality is so tightly bound up in wanting to know if A follows B and if that is the correct order of things, right? Yeah. It comes down to we are sort of trapped in our existence that moves forward in time. That again, we take time for granted, but time is moving forward. Events are happening. A turns A influences B, and we are so deeply rooted in this sort of flow of time and sort of the need for recognizing causal patterns, that it is wired to our sense of reality and to our sense of what is most meaningful. And it also illuminates why I think sometimes the older you get, the more difficult it is to perhaps reach for breakthroughs or step outside of yourself, because some of the causal patterns that you thought were true, you've been working with those assumptions for decades. You've been like, well, this is how it is. This is how the world works. Because you thought that you were seeing causal patterns everywhere. And when these patterns that you thought were causal have been at play in your life for decades, it can take it might require a real profound insight to break those patterns and say, no, you actually were living under a illusionary belief this entire time. Then this pattern that you thought was causal was not causal at all. There was no actual cause and effect relationship. You just imposed that on there. And it can be striking when you have that realization later in life that, oh, I was living, and it makes sense why people think, oh, I was living in illusion the whole time, because it could be a very long time that you're living with an illusionary belief like that. So it kind of made sense
actually,
why it can seem so profound.
No, totally. I mean, and actually, so if you'll forgive me, I have like three thoughts that is like concurrently with that. So one is, I've been working with a friend on some of this. Even if it's not at an older age, quote unquote, if you've been living under that illusion for a long time, it can be very devastating. So, for instance, one of the things you and I both commented on is kind of the woke or the victim culture, the kind of race to the bottom we have, right? And so part of what's happening there is you're prolonging your childhood, right? Children are victims of circumstance to a very large degree. Like, you're not in control, right? And so waking up to the fact that, no, you're in charge of your life, and whatever hand you were dealt, you have to play, right? You can't just sit and whine about the hand, right? And that transformation now is happening later in life. Somebody may be, 40, 45, and then realize, oh, I've basically prolonged my adolescence to 40, right? And not taken control of the fact that I'm supposed to be running my life, right? The longer it goes, the more painful it is when that transformation happens, because you have set up so much of your life around a particular view. And then that view is revealed to be an illusion. You've been bullshitting yourself, and now your friends, you made friends with people that had a similar view. You've set up your life that way, your colleagues, everything.
Yeah.
So that's one problem, right? Then that segues into the next problem, which is, and I'll bring in some additional language here on some level, just from other reading, is, as you know, I'm working on a book on kind of like relationships and stuff, and one of the books that I have found most formative is a book called The Art of Intimacy. And he says one of the barriers, he frames intimacy actually in a lot of ways as the being mode. It's actually kind of an interesting corollary if you happen to read that. But one of the obstacles to intimacy that he frames is prejudgment. Is saying, well, I know how this is going to go. I know who you are and how you're going to respond, right? And so my parents were here, and if they watched this, you know what you did. They were arguing. So my parents were arguing this weekend when they came to visit, and it is what it is. They've been married for a long time. But part of the argument was one of them was saying, okay, hey, we could do this. I could do this differently. And the other one was like, you're not going to do that. Let's be real, right? You're not, I've known you for 50 years, and, you're not going to change. You've always been this way. You'll always be that way, right? And that is an obstacle to transformation, right? To being, and that's kind of the value of an altered state of consciousness. Maybe the neuroplasticity, maybe the whatever, is that when you see things new, you can allow the world to be new. You can allow your partner to be new, and then you can allow yourself to be new, right? You can say, well, I can interact, just because I've interacted with the world this way, I actually can start to interact with the world differently. And yes, that may wreck a lot of my relationships, right? Because not all relationships have room for that kind of transformation. Some do, and some really intimate relationships have room for that person to be very different. But, if somebody's, married with kids or whatever, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, I've had a transformation and I need to go to, Nepal to be a Buddhist monk. Well, and that was kind of what he said about the Buddha too, right? Is that like, he left his wife and kids, and you're like, okay, well, I don't know how I feel about that morally, right? And so, yeah, I think it highlights kind of that challenge of are you being intimate with your partner? Are you being intimate with the universe? Are you being intimate with your friends? And I'm using that term intimacy to frame kind of a being mode that is in contact with reality and contact with the reality of who you really are. I guess maybe that's the reality that I'm talking about. And then if you have an insight into that, if you have a transformational insight into who you really are, well, that can be quite devastating, because you've set up an entire life, an entire set of situations and relationships on an illusory concept of yourself.
Yeah, it also that there's people who will take psychedelics, for example, and after that, reorder their lives entirely, right? Restructure them entirely,
Sure.
Because something about the psychedelic experience lends itself perhaps to forming insight. I've taken some psychedelics, and I don't know that I've had any sort of profound insights that way, but at the same time, usually when I'm taking them, I'm not really engaging in, any kind of intensive contemplative practices, right, where I'm meditating or hyper-focused, trying to get myself into some sort of a flow state, and with some of the language that he's used in the last couple of lectures, which is salience landscaping, so what it would be like to take some psychedelics and then, or maybe spend half the day meditating and then take psychedelics and then, continue the meditation as a psychedelics or sort of like, operating, so, it's actually given me, ideas on how to perhaps work with psychedelics, personally again, going forward, right? Because a lot of the times, people talk about set and setting is important, that's obviously fine. But I think whenever I do take them, I sort of just let them affect me as opposed to trying to work with them to consciously alter my salience landscape. Right now I have some language for like some of these ideas. So if I were to take it the next time, perhaps then I meditate over some fundamental assumptions I've made about my life, where I think I am, what I think I need, where I need to be going and how to get there. All things that I sort of perhaps have collapsed the waveform and resulted in the conclusions that were never really challenged, right? Because I never really challenged the underlying assumptions, right? I never tracked those assumptions all the way back to the salience landscape from which they emerged, to use to keep using this language, right? And then do psychedelics allow you to sort of rummage through your mind and try to uncover and unpack how it is that these conclusions arose in consciousness and why it is that I've settled on them to begin with, right? And that's
And it
that's
can
something.
be, it can also be an interesting, so going back to the juggling example, right? Is you can realize that part of the problem is you've been trying to practice throwing one ball better and better. You've been trying to optimize how well you can throw one ball from one hand to the next. That will not get you to juggling five balls. It's a necessary part of it, right? But optimizing it further will not suddenly get you there, right? What you're missing is the try and fail process of finding that rhythm. You're solving the wrong problem, right? And so, yeah, it's an interesting question is how to work with psychedelics to not just have insight into a problem, but to have insight into which problems you're trying to solve and what you're trying to or the notion of having insight. I go back to that kind of the candy example. Um, it's like, okay, what are you finding relevant that you should not? That's also, it's subtractive as well, right?
Hmm.
So it's not just an additional insight, but it's also subtraction that, oh, I had a false insight that the spaces between the candies should be taken into account. And I realized, oh, actually, that's not a factor at all, right? Um, so that's also an insight, but it's sort of subtractive rather than additive in terms of relevancy. Um, yeah, it'd be interesting to be able to systematize the use of psychedelics
Yeah.
for uh, for maybe solving the bigger problem or solving the bigger transformation, right? Um,
Well, I will certainly run some experiments for the sake of science and report
very good,
back.
very good.
I've the two of us, I've had a bit more experience with these substances, and
Oh
I
yeah, no,
always take them. I always take them with like intentionality, right? I never take them
yeah, yeah.
recreationally, and I take them seldom. And it's always to try to like dig deep and try to gain some quote unquote insight. But without sort of a landscape, I mean, not to use that word again, but without sort of a roadmap on like what I should try to be maybe doing when I'm in this state of mind, it becomes sort of difficult, right? I mean, I remember vividly once I took like a pretty large dose, and what I was trying to get at is how is there something from nothing, right? That was the
Mm,
question in my mind that I was trying to solve, which is impenetrable, right? And all I
yeah,
really got into contact with when I during that, because I really thought about it, I'm like, how is it that there is something and not nothing? How is it that all this arose out of nothing? Why does anything exist? What is existence? These questions are really not, I think, solvable in any state of mind, really. uh, Whereas, now perhaps if there is something that I'm going through that I'm not, that I'm unsettled about, or there's some burning question in my mind about existentialism, about a relationship, or about how to move myself forward in a career, or how to deal with a certain problem, perhaps now taking a small amount of psychedelics and then getting into sort of a meditative posture might be another way to address, or to sort of leverage the power of psychedelics, right? And then you can experiment
maybe.
with different doses, right? It's like, okay, if you take too large a dose, you have no control over anything. But if the dose is small enough, then you have a bit more agency to sort of rummage around and question the salience landscape machinery. And again, I'm just spitballing. I'm not
Yeah,
making
yeah.
any
No,
prescriptive arguments.
no. I mean, I'm curious as you are. I mean, I certainly think that yeah, it's an interesting idea of meditation or whatever. But I would challenge actually. So again, other notions, right? It's like, well, without psychedelics, how do you solve a problem, right? Well, you kind of contemplate and you meditate and you think about it and you write about it, right? And so maybe the issue is just, again, not trying to deliberately engage in the same thing on a psychedelic. Like, and so what I'm getting at is one of the most interesting quotes for me from The Art of Intimacy, which I mentioned before, is if intimacy is a way of being, how do you get into that way of being, right? Because if it's a way of being, it's nothing you do, right? And so the question is, what can I do in order to be in the being mode, right? And his answer is there's only one thing that actually helps, and that's play. Playfulness, playing, and he doesn't mean playing, well, I mean, all forms of play, but often the attitude of play that children have, which is a very sort of serious form of play. Like when children are playing make-believe, it's, you can't be the red Power Ranger, I'm the red Power Ranger, and there aren't two. It doesn't work that way, right? Like, and they're very adamant. Like, there can be tears, there's genuine emotion there, and yet they know it's make-believe, right? But they take it seriously, and that sort of, serious play? Where the playfulness is engaged so deeply that it becomes real, I think that can open up ways of solving problems, ways of becoming new, finding new patterns that that's been my curiosity is, could a psychedelic enhance that process if you just engage with play non-directionally, right? Rather than trying to set an intention super explicitly, this is the problem I'm working on, to say, okay, I'm going to take this and I'm going to play with how my mind solves problems. I'm gonna just dance around, right? And really engage in expanding the ways that I can be in the world, right? Then I think the opportunity for sideways insight is like, oh, yeah, I was solving this problem the wrong way. It's not something I need to read and write about. It's not something I need to study on, contemplate. It's something I need to dance with. And that's just a different problem-solving method, right?
No, it definitely is. I think there's definitely that. That's definitely one mechanism of doing it as well, for sure. I mean, there's and he also talked about other ways in which people alter their consciousness, right? So, like he didn't mention this, but whirling dervishes, for example, will
exactly
spin in a circle, to sort of get their states altered. There's also like, the Sufis would do dhikr, just repeatedly sort of, chanting, repeating a certain, chanting word. And it's really sort of, and, he talked about the shaman, right? Which is a very, dancing around, a certain a fire maybe, or engaging in ritual, which is another actually very interesting way of altering consciousness, as well as just being involved in a ritual. As well, just doing things that you're not normally used to doing. I was actually thinking the other day, I'm not a very good swimmer at all, and so I don't spend a lot of time in the water. But every time I do go in the water, that it's a different state, right? Everything feels different. I mean, the sensation is different, temperature is different. I'm wearing a different amount of clothes. I'm engaging in exercise that is completely, relatively foreign to me. And I always notice, that because it's novel and because it's different, I'm sort of in a different state of mind as a result, right? And as you also know, that I'm a huge, I have a great love of travel, right? And when I do go to a new place that I haven't been to before, the smell of the place and the sound of the place and what the buildings look like, that, I notice the differences, all of that kind of puts me into a different state of mind as well, right? So, I mean, we've been talking about psychedelics, and those are all great as well, but there's also other ways of doing that, right? And I mean, for example, how many times do we hear about, well, you're really stuck on a problem, go out for a walk, right? Because you're changing your environment, right? You're contemplating in a completely different sort of frame. You're actually moving through the earth, maybe you are surrounded by trees, right? And you're in a completely different environment compared to your desk, right? Or staring at a computer screen.
And we have this archetypal modality, right? I mean, we see that all the time in movies and in TV shows, right? Is that Sherlock Holmes is working on a problem, and what does he do? He goes and does something else. Yeah. Right? I mean,
he does that
or
too.
House, right? House is like, the whole show was framed around this form of insight. Is I'll go do something crazy and then have some conversation with someone about this other thing, and all of a sudden my brain will make the connection to the case, right? And so on some level, the show was just about sort of deliberately engaging in the practice of altering frame in order to gain insight in a different arena by analogy, right? Going back several lectures, the second lecture, to the notion of metaphor, right? But I would also say is that, like, if you're trying to learn to juggle, going back to that example, it's much better. You're going to get a lot further having an attitude of playfulness than an attitude of, let me grind this out, right? I'm going to juggle, right? Like, rather than like the playfulness of just saying, hey, I'm going to give this a shot. If it falls, no big deal. I'm not going to whatever. And so I think that's true of a lot of these types of problems where, hey, let me go play. Let me go do something. Because you're not, you said walking, right? Well, walking isn't, something grinding. It's not something, whatever. It is kind of opening up, right? People have that with running, people have that with weightlifting, but it depends on your attitude towards the thing as to whether that thing will serve this purpose of pushing you into a different frame, right? So many people, I think, gain benefit from working out or whatever. For me, it's a very grindy type thing, so I've never really perceived those benefits because it's not an open frame for me. It's not a playful frame, right? Reading is. So often I'll go read fiction totally unrelated to the problem I'm working on because it puts me in a more flexible frame, right? Akin to what people experience with walking or other things.
It's also an interesting observation that occurred to me while you were talking about, the juggling, right? Like, I'm going to juggle, I need to just grind it out, is that, altering your state of consciousness and therefore adjusting your salience landscape is not an effortful, activity. It's not like it costs you calories, right? It's a perspective shift. Altering your state of consciousness by saying, sure, it's effortful if you go for a walk, right? But what I'm getting at, you could also get into the tub, right? Just do a warm bubble bath or something, or read a book or something, right? Or meditate or whatever, right? And shifting frame like that and reframing it's not a problem of effort. It's a problem of perspective shift. There's something there.
Tuning. It's tuning to the right level of effort. It's not no effort. You're not asleep.
Yeah.
Right?
But it's not a problem of effort. It's not like work harder and then you will solve the problem, right?
It's not a pure insufficiency of effort. Often it is an excess of effort, right?
And
you need to reduce your effort level, not to zero, but less than where you're at, right?
Yeah. And I think what's
so
hidden
examples, the magic
what's
eye
tied
problem.
up in the idea of like it's not about enough effort is that when you try too hard, you are calcifying your salience landscape. You're like, this is how it is. And when you work too hard, it's not the salience landscape that you're changing. It's like, okay, this is the salience landscape. Let me knock around all of its borders as hard as I can and try to wrangle a solution out of the salience landscape, where the problem is, no, you have arrived at the wrong landscape. You need to go back in it and reorder your landscape. And that's not a problem of like expend this many calories, do it. It's a shift, right?
And it is that form of effortless effort, right? Learning that ability to make that shift, the skill to shift to a... Yes, exactly right.
Right.
Learning to shift your method of problem solving to a less effortful form intentionally is a skill, right? That, and again,
Yeah.
that's an ability. It's an insight about insights, right? And it is often, I think many people struggle with this as pressure goes up. So if I suddenly tell you, hey, if you don't learn to juggle in the next 3 months, I'm going to shoot you. Well,
Right.
learning to still be playful in your attitude towards learning is going to take a bit of effort, right? It is the best option. That is how you will learn best.
Yeah.
And yet, we struggle when the stakes are high. I mean, so many martial arts books talk about this, right? The Morimoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings, he gives the example is that, if I put a 3-foot wide board on the ground and said, okay, walk across this, you'd have no problems. If I suspended it in the air 1,000 feet between two castles, right? All of a sudden, that board appears much more narrow than it is, right? It's the same board, 3 feet wide, super easy, doesn't require a whole lot of balance. But when the stakes are high, we struggle to approach it the same way. And a lot of martial arts is teaching you, like, hey, even though the consequence is being hit in the face or being killed or whatever, learning it, you have to learn it the same way. And in fact, you have to do it the same way, right? Because if you tighten up and start putting more effort in, you're actually going to do worse. And so much of what you see in UFC or whatever, all these martial arts training is learning the skill of, even with high stakes, learning to relax into it, learning to be playful with it, learning to train playfully despite high stakes. And you and I know that that's exactly the basis in medical training. Why we make such ridiculous death jokes and such awful, whatever. And patients, we don't want patients to hear that necessarily because they think we're laughing at them. It's not. It's a way of finding the optimum practice stance. The optimum, if you can laugh at the problem a little bit, it's a way of spacing out the seriousness so that you actually do better. If you're captivated in the, this is a life or death moment, I got to run this code, I got to put this central line, you're actually going to do worse, right? Whereas if you can laugh it off, you make a silly joke or you make something that may seem cavalier to the patient's family if they were to hear it, it's actually an intuitive sense that we all have is this is a way of increasing performance by not getting captivated in the stakes, but approaching it a bit playfully in some sense, because that's where performance is optimum.
Yeah, I mean, how many times do you hear about, athletes saying that, it's all mental, right? It's because when you get to that level, you've learned all the tricks you need to. I mean, the vocabulary of, what you need to learn, like if you're playing tennis, well, these are the moves. This is how you do a forehand. This is how you do a backhand. This is how you move on the court. Those pieces are all there. And then you just, train to learn the pieces. But when you're on the field, when you're in the, final of Wimbledon or whatever, it's not like you didn't practice enough, right? You probably did if you're there. It's like in the moment, are you just going to be, sort of hyper vigilant, or are you going to let yourself relax into the flow state, right? There's no such thing as an intense, hyper concentrated flow state, right? A flow state is an easy state to be in, right? And this sort of like, just to sort of solidify this idea, because I think we're both sort of giving words to it at the same time, is that I think there's some skill to be, there's a skill in knowing when you're in a difficult situation, when you should actually be relaxing into that situation, right? When you should allow yourself to, loosen up, right? So that your, salience landscaping is not rigid, and you allow yourself, some plasticity in the situation, right? You're not fixated on, well, this is how it is. This is black and white. You have to let the frame be movable. You have to let the boundaries of the problem be movable. And that only comes from a state of relaxation, right? Because the more you concentrate, the more you try.
String's too tight in Vervaeke.
Yeah, exactly. The string is too tight. The more the landscape solidifies, and then you're just finding yourself like a pinball machine knocking in the landscape, an immovable landscape.
And in his words, it also can't be too loose, right? It's not like, you're at Wimbledon and like, I'm gonna lay down and take a nap, or like, I'm not, whatever. The ball's too far. I'm not gonna run that hard for it. It's
Right.
you can't get too loose either, right? It's finding that right frame, that right level of tightness, and I think the biggest takeaway here on some level is two things. Number one, if you have been practicing, there is a moment where you have to let your unconscious competence manifest. You have to choose to trust that you have gained some unconscious competence, or test whether you've gained some unconscious competence, and relax a little bit and see what happens, right? See what manifests. Number two is, we all, I think, have the tendency that as we perceive the stakes going up, we tighten the string. And that tendency is something to be resisted, to realize, no, optimum is optimum, right? Poker players, actually, that's probably, a lot of poker players talk about this, is, if you lose a big hand, when you misjudge, or maybe you don't even misjudge, maybe you play it exactly right, but somebody gets lucky or whatever. There's an emotional experience they call being on tilt, where you lose the ability to make good judgments, right? Because you're so emotionally rocked by that moment where things did not go according to plan, and that your mind just like freaks out, right? And learning to not go on tilt in response to a big loss is part of the skill of poker. Part of, and learning to regulate how you play regardless of the stakes. It's like, okay, hey, if you play for $100, you play for $1 million, the game is the same. They're just chips, right? But learning to perceive that, and learning to stay in that playful frame, that I'm going to play the game the same way, regardless of whether this is a $100 game or $1 million game, is very, very difficult. And learning not to over tighten the strings out of fear of loss, which is usually the thing that tightens your strings. I think avoiding that is one of the skills that you can gain from this kind of work, right? Is when you know how to meditate, you know how to contemplate, you know how to loosen and tighten your attention, you know how to shift, you have an insight about how to shift your salience landscape, right? In exactly the way and even these things that we talked about in this is like, even just saying, well, let me be more playful. Okay, that's a cue, but it's a cue to shift your salience landscape to perceive the world differently, to move or go for a walk or whatever we just talked about. All of those are, if you'll forgive me, are psychotechnologies, right? They're techniques that are replicable to change your mental frame, and the more you have of them, I think the better chance you have of not falling into over tightening the string, out of fear, or under tightening the string out of giving up. I think that's the other one, you see, is that, depression or whatever is just like, what does it matter? Like, just not even trying, right? Just completely letting the string go slack. Often because you tried over tightening it and it didn't work, right?
Yeah.
And so there is, I need to be looser, but it's like, not quite that loose, right? So I don't know, man. I think these psychotechnologies, these methods, these concepts can be incredibly powerful for people, with the caveat that they can also require a fair bit of destruction if you've set your life up on the basis of an illusion, right?
Yeah, creative and necessary destruction, right? I mean, I don't know that you even have to caveat it, right? Maybe the exact right thing that needs to happen in your life is some parts of it need to be torn down. And that can be painful, right? But, as he talked about, when we have these higher states of consciousness where insight is so profound that it completely reorders our entire life, at the end of that, creative destruction is just like when Buddha, left his palace. At the end of that, there is a much healthier way to be that is worth the sacrifice of, tearing down some of the houses that you built up in your life, right? I mean, in fact, maybe those rooms are where, you've packed away misery, and you've packed away the salience landscape that is just, leading you to continue to live in error, right? And so, these explanations that he gave in this lecture, and, we're going to get into the next lecture about what he actually means by higher state of consciousness, but they are very useful in giving us language to try to describe how we may be looking at things differently, right? So in the future, like me and you are discussing some problem, we can now say to ourselves, like, have you assessed the salience landscape, correctly, right? Can you look at the problem differently by putting yourself in an altered state of consciousness, whether that means going for a walk, going on a trip, doing something somewhat unusual, whether that's meditating or psychedelics or going for a walk or going for a swim or going to another country, or eating a food that you've never eaten before. I mean, whatever, right? Sure. I remember the guy who wrote the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown, he talked about how he got creative ideas, right, or how he pushed through creative, points where he was stuck. And one of the things he would do is that he would hang in his room upside down. He would just hang upside down. And back then it was like, well, that brings blood to the brain and blah blah blah. And when I was reading, I'm like, that's stupid. I don't think it actually results in anything meaningful in the brain. But what he was doing is he was just putting himself in an altered state of altered state of experience. Correct. So that's a tool you can use, knowing now what the mechanism behind how it works is, right? And it doesn't always have to work, right? But it's a tool. Like, okay, let me go for a walk. Let me do something that's outside of my normal sort of lived experience, and attend to a problem in that sort of state of mind.
I think that's the other reason I like the juggling analogy so much, is because you intuitively understand that when it doesn't work, it's not that you're doing anything wrong, right? You just have to keep doing, like, the method to success is failure. It's catastrophic failure in that sense, right? You throw 5 balls up in the air and you don't juggle and they all fall down, right away. It's immediate catastrophic failure, and yet each episode, each repetition pushes you toward that insight. And so, if you hang upside down and it doesn't work, quote unquote, it doesn't mean you should stop. It doesn't mean you should stop looking for the insight. And I think that's what, having those mental models, again, allows you to persist in switching frames, in reframing the problem, in reconceiving, you said, okay, now we can say, oh, you talked about your salience landscape. Okay, cool. Well, you figurize the salience landscape. Now that is a manipulable object in our mind, and that in itself is a way of shifting the framing of the problem. All of those things are options, and you just have to kind of keep understanding that you can have the insights. It just is a matter of continuing to persist to some degree.
Well, I look forward to the next lecture as well.
Yeah.
The quality of the lectures are just continue to be phenomenal. So, looking forward to the discussion on the next one. Are there any other final points you wanted to cover?
I think we covered everything from my standpoint.
All right, man. Good talk as always.
Cool, man.
See you in the next one.
Yeah.